were there any particular adversities in your life that you faced that almost made you want to give up, and how do you overcome them?
You know, I always identify myself, as a Latinx because I'm from Argentina, an immigrant because, I'm not from this country, and as a queer person. And I could tell you that throughout my life, those identities have exposed me to, prejudice, discrimination, and you name it. But at the same time, I would be lying to you if I don't tell you because I'm a cisgender, person. Because until I open my mouth, I look like a gringo, right? Very white. Because I had tons of access to education, right? I had 3 masters in my life. Don't do that, don't be a nerd. Just one is enough. Um, right? Sort of, I had a lot of privilege and access in my life. So I usually identify with, being Latinx, immigrant, and queer, just out of the pride that I feel, belonging to those communities. Um, that said, it's been almost 20 years that I lived in New York, and sort of the path of immigration, and mostly the first years when I came here, were not that easy, right? But at the same time, like I said, looking at the people that came at the same time that I came to New York in very similar conditions, and which the difference was that I spoke the language, I then didn't. The difference one that, they were black and brown, and, I look white, and a lot of the privilege, you can see how fast I was moving up the ladder, and, how they were being left behind. So I'd rather answer your question by telling you not necessarily, the oppressions that I felt, or the hardships that I felt, in my life, but just seeing how connecting with a group of people, and then seeing the difference that it makes, the privilege that I have, and make me very empathetic, to the challenges that others, suffer because they don't have the access that I have to opportunities.
So my question is about your career and your work. And it's, did you ever expect to work in the field of the arts? And if not, then what made you pursue this type of career?
My parents were very interested and very strongly suggesting that I would just go to school and get a diploma. Um, I was clear to me that I didn't want to be an artist, and there was not a lot of options, like it's not that somebody grows up thinking I want to be a museum director or I want to be a curator, right? A lot of those professions were not clear or accessible to me, right? And until you don't see something, you don't know that, that's what you like, right? So until I wasn't exposed through exhibition design to the work of a museum, I didn't know that that was a possibility for me. But I did know what I like, and I did know that I like it to work in a creative industry. So I negotiated with my parents, and I said, I'm gonna go to architecture school, get a diploma as an architect. And my parents says, after that you can do whatever you want, but as long as you get a diploma, you're fine. And while I used my time in architecture school to start exploring, in addition to being the people that design and build buildings, what else an architect can do. And it's just sort of like through the elective subjects that I could take, the classes that I could take, in the throughout the career, I was just sort of learning more and more into art history, into sort of theory, and just sort of pushing much more into that direction. And then, and through these experiences that I had either as an intern or either just looking for projects that, would expose me a little bit more to the field, is where I find, that I wanted to work in the arts. When I came to New York, I came to New York because I wanted to work at a museum. And I thought that, the only thing that you could do in a museum was being a curator. And I went back for a master's in museums and art history at City College in CUNY. And the first class that I took it because it was taught at the Guggenheim Museum in the Upper East Side, not because of what the class was. The class was museum education. And then I took the class and I was like, oh my God, I don't want to be a curator. I want to be a museum educator. And, that class exposed me, to the multiple options you can have as a museum educator, from doing public programs, doing work with teens, doing work with families, with schools, sort of like that idea that I constantly be trying to look at, what's out there and where the possibilities is what helped me inform my career.
My question's a little bit more specific about like how you got involved in directing museums. So I was just wondering, how did you first get involved in the Leslie Lohan Museum? And also, how did that experience prepare you to then become the city's Cultural Affairs Commissioner?
So before working at Leslie Lohan, I was working at Friends of the Highland, which is the organization that manages the, have you all been to the Highland, the park on the west side? It's an elevated park that was built on, on elevated railroad line, and they turned it was abandoned and they turned it into a park. And it's a big organization. The bigger the organizations, the most difficult is to make decisions. There's a lot of politics. And at some point, I just got fed up with that. And I said, my next job, there's going to be a few things that need to check in order for my next job to be the ideal job. And the number one is I want to be the boss. I just don't want to have to report to anyone. Little that I know that you always, if you don't have a boss, you have a client, but you always respond to somebody, right? So the idea, unless you're, independently rich, right? And probably then you respond to your parents or you respond to whatever. You always need to respond to somebody. But I wanted to be the boss. I want to be able to run the organization. I wanted to be a small organization under 20 people. The Leslie Lohan Museum, we were 16 of us, right? It was small enough. We can all make decisions. We can move fast. No politics. I wanted to be, I was working in a park, the Highland, and I wanted to go back to work in a cultural organization, museum check. And the fourth one was that I wanted to be walking distance from my house. And that was the only one that didn't check because I live in Jackson Heights and the Leslie Lohan Museum is in Soho. But I'm telling you this because as you start thinking about your careers, it's always good to know, what are the three things that, are important to me? And as you look at opportunities, are these opportunities, check or not? Sometimes you're gonna have to take a job because only one of the boxes check and you really need the job, right? But even if you really, if it's like that, you enter the job knowing that there's only so much, that your expectations are going to be met up to some point. It was, I really like working at the Leslie Lohan Museum and probably all the jobs I had, not necessarily because I was the boss, because at every step, at every job that I had, there was a challenge in front of me, right? When I was hired, those that hire me say, this is the problem we have, and we would like you to solve it. At El Museo del Barrio was to how we can bring more people, into the museum. And in the 8 years I was there, we sort of increased the audience, and Edwin and I used to work together there, and then at Leslie Lohan, we increased the audience of El Museo del Barrio like 10 times. It was crazy. Festivals, you name it. At the Highland, they hired me because the park is elevated and looks super fancy, and a lot of people doesn't feel welcome to that. And there's within a block from the Highland, there's 5,000 people living in public housing, and people didn't feel invited and connected with that. And we did a lot of work to increase not only the visitation from those specific neighbors, but from BIPOC people from all over the city that wouldn't otherwise visit a place that they didn't feel welcome. And at Leslie Lohan, although it was a museum that was specifically for the queer community, until I came in, it was very, it was only welcoming to white and gay men of an age. And there was a lot of people under the LGBTQ umbrella that didn't have anywhere else to go because there are no any other museums that really cater to those communities. And the one place that did so, it was very specific and very focused to a very specific audience. So that was the challenge. And I think, doing all that work, that if you start making connections, is about accessibility, is about inclusion, is about equity, is about community, is what made me a good candidate to be a commissioner of arts and culture for the city today. Because if you research a little bit the platform of our mayor, initially when he was campaigning, he said that that was his platform, right? He wanted to make sure that we were focusing on a city for everyone, not just for a few. So when those goals, overlap, that's what make, the mayor feel like, he could hire somebody like me, that my decisions were going to be informed by those values.
The question that I have for you is, have you created art of your own? And if not, would you credit most of your success to in the artistic field? Like, do you accredit it most to your artistic skill, or like the opportunities and the networking that you have gotten?
I am not an artist at all. I'm very bad at that. I'm very bad at dancing, very bad at painting, very bad at music. I'm horrible. So I don't have any artistic inclination. I do consider myself a creative person, but a creative in problem solving. Sort of like, and I think that comes with the training as an architect, right? We're trained to see this is the problem and what's the solution for that, and how to be creative about that. But probably one of the reasons I'm so inclined to work in arts and culture is because I really admire artists and the work that they do. So, and how inspiring that is. So, but no creative skills whatsoever.
Hi, so considering your influence in rebranding the Leslie Loan to be more like general and inclusive, I just wanted to know, like, what have you done or like plan on doing in government that's like within the same realm as like broadening spectrum?
So one thing they should know is that when I started interviewing for this job last December, my position was announced on March, I believe 11, which was a Wednesday. And then on March 13 is when, myself at Leslie Lohman and so many other fellow culture organizations directors, we all decided that we needed to close our culture organizations because of the pandemic, right? We felt that it wasn't safe for our staff to commute every day to open our museums, and we didn't feel it was safe for our visitors to. And by then, this is mid-March, we didn't know much about the pandemic. We knew what was happening in China, what was happening in Europe, and we really didn't know how much it was going to impact our lives and how much our lives were going to change, right? So I took a job before the pandemic, and then by the time I started my job, which was in mid-May, the world has changed completely, and the city has changed completely. So a lot of the thinking that I was doing, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that, changed completely.
What types of feedback have you gotten throughout your life, and how have they impacted your career and your plans for the future?
Oh my God, all these questions are amazing. You're making me think a lot. I was fortunate enough that throughout my life, I had a lot of mentors and a lot of people that took enough time to talk to me about their experiences and to help me, form my own ideas. From, professors in college to, colleagues in the field that, were older than me. But I think the biggest piece of advice and the biggest aha moment I had in my life was almost 20 years ago when and I'm just going to repeat myself for a minute, but I'm going to tell you the story and how powerful this was. When I moved to New York, I ended up renting a room in a basement in a 3-family house. In this house, it was all rooms for rent, and it was owned by a gay couple, one of them from Colombia and the other one from Paraguay. So almost everybody in that house, we were all immigrants from Latin America. And we would all, everybody would work at different times and whatever, but on Sundays we all get together, we all do a potluck, we all cook, and we all talk. And there were like two main topics of conversation. One was soccer, and the other one was discussing, potential paths to citizenship, for each of us. And, we all were in different situations. We all have different ways of doing that, or not. And I always remember that when I would bring up, my concern if I was going to be able to get a green card and then become a citizen, people keep saying, you're going to be fine, right? And I felt dismissed. And I was like, but why do you mean, why do you say that? And everybody would stay silent. And I remember after one of those meals, one of the owners of the house, he was like 60 some years old. He had seen a lot, he had seen a lot of people and a lot of immigrants come through, their house. And he pulls me aside and he says, you need to stop asking that question. And I said, what do you mean? And I said, I think it's time that you start recognizing, the privilege that you have over everybody else in this house. And that's when I really recognized that, yes, I was an immigrant like everybody else. I was in many ways, I was sharing the same conditions, but at the same time, I have all this advantage. And that was the first time that, I was introduced to ideas of privilege. And it's something that I keep with myself over and over again. And as I'm constantly growing in my career and accessing positions of powers like this, I constantly remind myself, how do I make sure that I bring the communities that I belong to and that were so helpful to me along.
At this moment, we are going to be asking you about your experience in the arts and your involvement in the government. So to start off with, can you tell us a little about how the art programs you're funding are having a positive influence in our society and are giving the youth a platform to succeed?
When you work in the city and you talk about arts and culture, one of the first things that you need to do is to make a for it, right? Just think yourself that you are the mayor of New York City today, and you have, the commissioner of health that's in charge of all hospitals and health for the city. You have the commissioner of transportation, all the buses, the subways, you name it, the trains. You have the commissioner of education, the Department of Education, and all the public schools. And then you have me, the commissioner of arts and culture. And we're all telling you that we need money. And we need money in a moment that the city, the economy of the city, the country, and the world is not doing well. And we're fighting for, just because we all believe in what we're doing, right? Where do you think, out of the 5 or 4, options I gave you, where would you put arts and culture? Would you go first before hospitals or after hospitals? I'm asking all of you, right? As a mayor.
Probably after.
Yeah, right. Probably, education, health, transportation, and what else I mentioned? Education, health, transportation, housing, right? They're usually, we all tend to think they're more important than arts and culture. Hopefully, after talking to me and after, spending time in this program, you change your mind a little bit. And I tell you why. I think, all those are really important, but, sometimes people tend to see arts and culture as entertainment. And my agency did a study back in 2015, 16, in which they were looking at, the social impact of the arts, right? So there's 3 ways in which you can talk about the impact of the arts. One is the intrinsic one, intrinsic as an interior one, right? Do you remember that moment that I tell you, when the sculpture is starting to be unveiled and how I get goosebumps, right? Being in contact with art is good for your soul. Nobody can argue with that. For many, many years, the city of New York talk about the economic impact of the arts, right? How a city of New York that has so much to offer, theaters, film, museums, zoos, you name it, right? Brings I think around 64 million tourists a year. This is pre-pandemic, right? Can you imagine 64 million tourists? There's in Argentina, there's only 40 million people living, right? Just picture, like everybody from Argentina coming to visit and then more. And when they come to the theaters, when they come to, the museums, what else they do? They pay for hotels, they go to restaurants, and so that creates, arts and culture creates economic development. Everybody agrees with that. But nobody knew until recently, I mean, we all knew, but nobody had measured, what's the social impact of the arts. And we did a study, I mean, this was before me, but the agency did a study that in those communities in which was opportunities to experience and participate in arts and culture, the rate of public health increase, public safety increase, high school, how you call it when you drop high school sort of retention, right, of students in schools increases, right? And the overall sort of social capital or cohesiveness of the community was much higher. So while health, education, transportation, they're all important, if you invest in the arts, you're going to probably prevent, people from getting sick, people from, not going to school, and so many other things. So it's a good investment. So a lot of my work is just to make sure that myself and those that are making decisions of where the money should go understand, the larger impact of arts and culture in communities.
Hola.
Hola.
Wanted to ask, what are some of the ways you've helped bring recognition to minority groups in New York City?
So, I work at when I first came to, I'm going to tell you, try to make it short, a story that, replicates over and over again, from the work I was doing. When I first came to New York, I landed here in Jackson Heights, Queens. This is one of the biggest secrets, but Jackson Heights, Queens is the second largest concentration of gay men in the city. Not everybody knows that because unlike, Chelsea and other sort of neighborhoods in which there's concentration of gay men, being gay is what defines you as who you are. When you're in Jackson Heights, you're probably also an immigrant. You're probably, a person of color. There's so many, your identities are so intersectional that, they are not necessarily defining, the neighborhood as sort of as a gay neighborhood. This is 20 years ago, before all of you were born. I'm sure it's going to be really difficult for you to imagine a world without these guys and without social media. But just imagine, like in order for you to meet other people, you will have to go out in the street, right? You cannot stay home and just connect, like the way we're connecting now. So, and what I realized with a friend of mine is that a lot of the gay men that were living in the neighborhood, because they were immigrants, because they didn't have enough money, because they didn't speak the language, they did not dare to travel all the way to the city in which, the culture organizations, the places in which, sort of gay community was getting together and was happening. So the only option that they had to go and meet other gay men and connect with the community was going to the bars. There's a few bars here in the neighborhood. Nothing wrong with the bars, but sometimes it's not the safest place, to meet other people. And I myself, and also you, Edwin, right? We're not drinkers, right?
I'm not a drinker.
So what happens with, somebody like me or Edwin that we don't drink and we just go to a bar and what do you do? So we decided with my friend that we were going to organize a monthly film screening of films that talk about the LGBTQ experience. But in addition to put a lot of emphasis on the quality of the film, we're going to put a lot of emphasis in making sure that those that were coming to see the film would spend enough time and they had enough opportunities to meet one another. So we would show the film, would have a conversation, if the director was available, we'll bring the director to have a conversation with the audience. And then we just have, some snacks, some, soda, and just give the opportunity of people to connect one another. As we start seeing people coming over and over and meet them, we would just say, Edwin, did you meet so-and-so? Ingrid, did you meet so-and-so? And just sort of like start building a community around a cultural experience. Why is that important? First of all, as I said before, there's nothing more empowering than seeing yourself reflected in society. A lot of the films that we were showing were not films that you could see on cable. There was no online streaming either, right? There was no Netflix or anything like that. I feel like my grandmother talking now. So, right, it was only very limited places in which you can see, films, and these films were, because we're so specific, were not available. There were no places in which you can meet others, right? Sort of that was the opportunity. And then that also led to the idea that, once you build a community, we start doing things together other than just watching the films. Participating on the Pride Parade here in Queens, right? Start going to the city as a group and finding things that we could do for free that maybe we would not have, made aware if we were not part of this community, right? So I spent a minute to talk about Cinema Rosa, which was the name of that program, because that was very much the sort of the format of everything else I did at the Museo del Barrio, at the Highline, and at the Les Loman Museum, right? How do we create cultural experiences that are empowering because you reflect, the communities of color or marginal communities? How those opportunities allow you to connect with somebody, with something that's larger than yourself, with a community, and then how we can inspire you to take leadership on your community, right? Which is the civic participation.
How do you work with opposing groups that object to your proposals and ideas?
It's a great question. In a lot of the organizations that I came in, even though I came in to create change, right? The Museo del Barrio was to how do we transcend, from this very specific group of people, and we just start being relevant to larger, group, different communities. At the Highline also, how do we change, how these places perceive? Les Loman is how do we open up, from gay men to so many others? And it's interesting because people want to see change, but they don't want anything to change, right? People want usually the results of the change, but they don't want to change themselves, and they don't want anything to change, right? So there's a lot of the times, a lot of the work that I have done, you have a lot of pushback. With enough experience and with a lot of people, I learned that, it's easier to bring people along than just to have them fight you, till the end. So I'm a huge friend of pilot experiences, right? Just start very small and start sort of like in a corner without nobody seeing, because rather than me, I could just sit here and tell you about all my ideas for change, for hours, but until you don't see it, and until you don't experience it, and until you don't realize that, it's not threatening to you, or, like it's, some people won't buy it, right? So the change has to be incremental, and the change has to be, again, participatory. That said, and of all the pushback that I got in my career, probably the most pushback I got from the white gay men of certain age. This was an older generation, right? 65-year-old white gay man at Les Loman. And there are two things that you should consider when you face that. One is you have to act with conviction, right? If what you do is what you believe, you make enough space to bring people along. But if the people says it's all or nothing, then there's nothing for us to talk. And, somebody has to move on. And in that case were some of these men that they were saying this museum should be only for us and nobody else. But at the same time, for me to develop the, like I said, I could tell you about all the oppression that I've suffered in my life, and I would be lying to you if I don't tell you all the privilege that I had. Well, all these white gay men compared to, lesbians, trans, queer, bisexual, communities, and mostly of those communities that intersect with communities of color, have, a lot more oppression than this group of gay men that may look privileged next to them. This was a generation that fought really hard, for their liberation and the liberation of, a lot of people in the LGBTQ community. So to their eyes, all of a sudden, this little space that they had built for themselves to feel safe, to not for, to feel, that they're not going to be discriminated, all of a sudden, the other, and the unknown was coming and taking over. So, I really needed to, that didn't stop me for creating change, but that did inform the way that I was going to communicate with them about how this museum needed to be a lot more open. And it wasn't a zero-sum game that if we were giving more to others, they were going to get less. It was in the best interest for all of us and all the communities to share this space.
And my question is, what do you envision that your programs will do in support of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Oh my God, that's an amazing question. There's a couple of things about that. And, I'm gonna answer from the perspective of somebody working at the city administration. First of all, I wanna say that I'm excited that, finally there has been an awareness at the mainstream level of the injustices that, specifically the African American or Black community have been suffering for not even decades, for centuries in this country. And unfortunately, we had to experience a global pandemic that forces us all to slow down in order to pay attention to, whatever is the experience of those that are like sitting next to us in the subway or sitting across us, the office, right? But if there's a silver lining of this pandemic is that, I'm happy that, those that have privilege and they're in the mainstream, they're finally understanding, what oppression looks like for by POC communities. That's number one. Number two, I think there's two reactions to this, right? And because there has been so much oppression for so long that people really wanted to see really actionable things. They didn't want to see, if you get another letter from, another corporation or another culture organization saying, we're going to have conversations about this, you just enough of this. I want to see action. And some of that action manifested in two ways that are very similar. One is by people or administrations taking down monuments, mostly Confederate monuments, but also other monuments that did not represent the values that we have as a society. And the other way was manifested by these public art murals that were painted in pavements across the city, really spelling out Black Lives Matter, right? That's great, but those are symbols, right? And in order for those symbols to have value, we really need to do a lot of work to change our society, right? Because those murals are gonna be gone, they're not here forever. And because the new monuments that we wanna put, acknowledging the contributions that by POC communities have had to our society, it's gonna take a while to come. But, we need to do change, radical change and structural change, systemic change, right? And one of the things that I'm doing myself is, while my agency is asking culture organizations to really put, what they call diversity, inclusion, and equity plans, and how they're going to fight racism in each of their organizations, I felt it was completely inauthentic for us to do that if we are an agency doing that ourselves, right? And the work that we're going to do is going to be in three parts. One is give resources so each of us can do our personal work, right? And investigate our privilege, investigate our role in a system that is, racist. Then the work that we're going to do internally as a group, how we're going to work together, and how we're going to make sure that the policies and procedures that form our organizational culture, right, the way we work, is going to be inclusive and not racist. And then, you know, how does the work that we do with the outside, right, the grants that we give, the public art that we install, you know, the projects that we embark with other cultural organizations, how that is also informed by values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is what I tell everyone is the job, you know, is a long-term, you know, work. You know, you spend a lifetime, you know, and learning and undoing a lot of the things that we learn, you know, in terms of, you know, racial justice. But we need to do it, and we need to do it in an authentic way.
Okay, this is the closing question or questions. It's 2 in 1. That being, how does the Cultural Affairs Department work in funding different programs, and what is creating such a big divide in funding towards schools and art programs?
So a couple of things. Not to answer that question, but you know, my agency, the Department of Cultural Affairs, has no jurisdiction on education, on public schools. You know, that's the Department of Education. We do collaborate with them in arts education, and we are trying to make, in the last budget that was approved in July, you know, for this school year, unfortunately, a lot of the money for arts and culture was that, you know, the same way that I was telling you that, you know, the mayor looks at things, you know, it needs to prioritize. When the chancellor of the Department of Education has looked at things, you know, he has to prioritize, you know, and the priority wasn't necessarily arts education. We're working to see how working with cultural organizations, we can complement that through programs like the ones that you have now throughout the year. But specifically the funding that my agency has, where do you think, and this is a question for all of you, where do you think the money that the city has comes from?
Taxes.
Who said that?
I did. Aida, over here.
Aida, what did you say?
I said taxes.
Taxes, right? Comes from all of us. We pay taxes when we buy things. We pay taxes, you know, if we own a house, and we pay taxes, you know, when we get paid for our jobs, right? A portion of that goes to the city. So the city takes all the money, this money from us, and, you know, we expect the city to provide services like free education, like, you know, hospitals, like transportation, like arts and culture. So because that money is coming from all of you, and because it's public money, we want to be very careful the way that me and say, you know, you get this much and you get this much. We want to do it in a democratic way. And it's a super long process, but I'm going to just try to explain it in 2 seconds, which is every year organizations write grants, and they say, you know, if you give us so much money, we're going to do so many programs. When we receive those grants, what we do is we hire what we call is a peer panel, which hire people like Ingrid, like Edwin, people that work in museums, and they come and they read those grants, and then they all get together in a room until now. Now we're gonna be doing it on Zoom, but they all get together in a room and they look at the proposals that the organizations write, and they grade them, right? They give them some points. And then based on all the points that all the peers, you know, people working in the field give them to the proposals, then there's an algorithm that help us distribute the money based on, you know, how good the proposal is. And then the organizations get the money. And then at the end of the year, they need to write back to us and tell us, you know, we told you that we were going to do X, Y, and Z with your money. Thank you. We were able to do X and Y. We couldn't do C, but in exchange of C, we did M, whatever, right? You know, and then they allow them to apply for the next year for funding again.
Well, thank you so much, Gonzalo. for this beautiful conversation.
Thank you, all of you. It was great to meet you, although through Zoom, and hopefully I can meet you, all of you, soon if museums open.